All right, so we are now recording, so welcome everyone. Happy New Year if you have just joined for the first of our weekly calls of the new year. And I will now seamlessly hand back to Vinny to just reprise some thoughts from just before Christmas to kick off the conversation that sort of took place on the mailing list last week or so. So Vinny, back over to you.
Yeah, so I think that, what I was trying to just raise is really an observation of a set of problems versus prescribing a solution. As I'm not sure I'm the best solutionizer out there, but anyway, the basic problem is I don't see a really good ecosystem in place for essentially arriving at a common outcome for both the network and the user in terms of encrypted DNS. So there are a set of scenarios where the user may have a set of selections that they would accept, and similarly the network would have maybe an alternative set of selections that they would accept, and there's no real way to resolve those differences if there are differences. And I see this getting more complex if it becomes a point where DNS and content are multiplexed together, because from a network perspective, it'll all just look like HTTPS traffic. And content and DNS would end up being potentially multiplexed in the same channel. So that was sort of the topical discussion. And there are ways today to do things like block the bootstrapping of encrypted DNS. But again, it still doesn't solve the problem where if a user has provisioned their endpoint to go to an explicit DOE server and the network has a different opinion on that, that there's a way for the two of those entities to collaborate and come up with an acceptable outcome. And that outcome might be that a different DOE selection is made, or different encrypted DNS. We'll just say that in general, it doesn't have to be DOE, but a different encrypted DNS selection is made, or the user opts not to use the network because they don't feel it meets their requirements. And the goal is really just to avoid what is happening right now, which I'm observing from our side at Cisco, and just in terms of service offerings, is it really is becoming like a whack-a-mole approach where the network is blocking a bunch of DOE services via IP address, and then or it's looking at service record types and blocking those to prevent bootstrapping of encrypted DNS. And I don't think the user really is giving good feedback in that case, and it doesn't really convey what the intentions are. And so I'm just wondering, is there a better system that we could build that allows for the network to have a set of policies, a user to have a set of preferences, and then to work those differences out in a manner where the user makes a consensual decision to either participate with a different configuration or just not use the network. So that, I think, is a long-winded way of sort of summarizing what the discussion was about. And as I noted, this gets really very complex when content and DNS are multiplexed together in the future, if they are. And I don't know that there's a good solution for that. So that was sort of the topic.
Fantastic, thank you, Vinny. That's an excellent way of encapsulating. I think it was the best part of 45 minutes or so discussion into less than 5. So Really helpful. I think the key thing there was, I think you wanted a negotiated, agreed outcome, ideally, from this, which was the key facet. Or that was my take out anyway from the discussion last time. Now, some people will have seen that then prompted some discussion, and I know Tommy, you had some thoughts that then engendered, because I know you weren't on the call last time. So did you want to come in and maybe just comment on that? Because I know in the discussion we had last time, we made specific reference to the DEER proposal, and I think your take was that maybe it mischaracterized the functionality of DEER, not in a bad way, but just so maybe give some clarification on that and add your thoughts.
Certainly, and Happy New Year, everyone. My comments were largely based on the notes. I'm guessing if I had been there, it wouldn't have been as much of an issue. Nothing to say about the notes, just they are two different topics, although tightly related, right? DEER doesn't try to solve the problem because the problem exists today and has existed for some time, that a client and a network can't securely negotiate their requirements. The network provides recommendations. None of this is new information. It's just that DEER doesn't attempt to solve that problem. In parallel, I do agree with the community at large that this is a fantastic problem to solve. They are related, but the question of, if I only have an IP address, how do I find an encrypted DNS server with whom I can speak? And the question of, if I join a network, how can I politely negotiate what they allow and what I want? Related but different questions. DEER only tries to solve one of them.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Tommy. And I see Glenn has got his virtual hands raised. So can I ask you, if others want to jump in, if you could follow Glenn's fine example and raise your virtual hand, either using the facility on Zoom or simply just put in chat that you want to say something, and I'll come to you roughly in the order that you might indicate your interest. So Glenn, do you want to jump in?
Well, hello, and Happy New Year to everybody. You're my very first call of 2021, so yay. So I missed the last call. It sounds like you guys had a lot of fun. So I had a couple of clarifying questions I sort of wanted to tease out here, so I understand the full intent of the conversation that was had. The first one is, Vinny, what is this notion of, or you mentioned a couple times of like DNS mixing with content? What content are you talking about? Are you talking about like application layer versus network layer, like, just basic addresses versus application awareness? Or that's my first question. How about we go back and forth? So I'll ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Yeah, so I've asked on various mailers, sort of teasing out, hey, are there plans for implementers to multiplex content and DNS together, since the protocols sort of allow for that, right? So when QUIC and HTTP3 are, widely deployed, you could, in theory, multiplex your DNS requests in with your content requests. So, for example, if you hit a domain for Apple, let's just say, and you wanted to go to one of its subdomains, you could serve back the DNS response as part of that initial landing at the Apple domain, right? So you could sort of multiplex that content together. I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but it's certainly a possibility. And it was brought up as one of the topic items that, hey, if we end up multiplexing both DNS and content, and that would be, web content that's being served in the same multiplexed channel, the network really, from a policy perspective, can't apply any policies, because you can't simply block a CDN address space, right, in that case. So today with DOE, right, if a network operator wants to, they can block all of the well-known DOE servers. And that's what a lot of enterprises do. But once that DNS and content get multiplexed together, if they do, that problem is not easily solved just by blocking IP addresses. And since the bootstrapping of that would likely be over the same HTTPS connection that's doing the content serving, it's not something you would be able to block from bootstrapping either, because it's all part of the encrypted channel. So that was sort of the, hey, if it goes in this direction, this would be pretty complex, right? For a network, from a network perspective, in terms of policy enforcement.
Gotcha. Okay, that clarifies that. My next question is, in this discussion, this seems to be trending towards, so in the enterprise space, in highly managed enterprise spaces, not all of them, but in the managed ones, there is this notion of profiles. Different environments call them different things, but it's essentially a profile that says to the device, hey, we, the enterprise, want you to behave in the following way, and here's a set of rules that we are going to enforce on you, the device, for when you interact with the world. This conversation seems to be sort of trending towards, how do we give sort of all the good benefits of managed profiles, the reliability, it's going to work guarantee of enterprise managed devices, to sort of the rabble of unmanaged devices that are the larger case of people using things on the network. Is that sort of an accurate characterization of part of this discussion?
Yeah, so I point out, and it was in the backup slides, the precise examples, but I point out in the very first slide that the network operator and device owner are often not the same entity. So in the case of an enterprise managed network, your corporate network, typically there's some policies in place around, you have to use MDM, you have to enroll your device if you want to use it. But there's a large swath of enterprise network types, like guest networks, that aren't, that don't manage the actual device because the user is a guest, right? So, so that user wants to use your network, and you still want to apply your policies. So a good example of that is like the educational sector, where they mandated to do content filtering, and parents come to the school and visit, and they join the Wi-Fi network. They don't enroll in an MDM profile. They just join the Wi-Fi network as a guest, and whatever the network policies are get applied. Now, if you configured your device with an explicit DOE service on your device, then you're bypassing that content filtering of that educational network, and there's not really a good way to resolve that conflict, right? So I, as a parent, want to join the network to view my child's presentations, but the network wants to apply some policies, and that's sort of the example of where this conflict arises. So in the case where it's an enterprise managed device and an enterprise managed network, and they're the same entity, there is no issue, right? You just apply an MDM policy. It's in these other cases, guest networks being the most common, where this sort of issue arises.
Okay. I'd add, in addition to guest networks, like home networks as well, because a lot of people attempt to enforce home network level policies in some form or fashion, especially parents of young children. And so that sort of expands the scope a little bit, but I think in an important direction of combining guest networks and home networks.
Yeah, there's a whole range of, contractor working at IBM is contracted to work for Cisco, and they're joining Cisco's network. The device is managed by IBM, the network is managed by Cisco. Whose policies do you enforce there, right? That's sort of another example, and a very common one, right? Where contractors are working for a company and they're joining their network with a device that's not managed by that company. And so you can't apply an MDM profile to that device.
Okay, thanks. That was my set of questions. I yield my time to the next senator.
There'll be a lot of that in the next few days, I guess, for some of us. Glenn, thank you. Fantastic. Okay, that's helpful. Some clarification. Now I see on the chat. I'll just read these out, and then people that made these comments can jump in as appropriate. So I think Barbara was just commenting, it wasn't necessarily about negotiation per se. It was more about the network staking its policies and the end user, or the client, I guess, more specifically, rather than the end user, either making a decision to proceed or not, or potentially, I think, if I recall the presentation, Vinny, if the client software and the network don't agree, then presenting to the device user what any options might be for the user to make a decision potentially. Yeah, I think was the gist of it. Pat has then raised some points around certificate pinning and bootstrapping. I think you kind of covered those in the discussion just now. Vinny, Pat, do you think any of that was not covered? And in which case, do you want to just restate it slightly?
Just to really kind of to highlight that the issue of saying that you can intercept a distant DOS server on a visiting network, it may not necessarily ring true, particularly where you have session resumption and you've got zero round trip because, you know, for example, certificate is already cached or pinned. So I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to hear from the speaker later about DNS over quick. You know, quick support session resumption, a bit like some TCP extension. So it's going to be a real challenge, I think, particularly for the enterprise networks. So
great. Well, we can certainly pick that up next week with Andre from AdGuard, who some of you may have noticed will be joining us this time next week to talk about the AdGuard DNS over quick resolver announcement. Okay, that's a good point. Tommy has then commented on Barbara's discussion. Yeah, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. And rightly highlights that, yeah, there isn't necessarily a user at all points if it's an IoT device, for example. Yeah, so it's a bit more complicated in those cases. Now, I know also on
quickly, sorry, I just commenting on that IoT device. If the two disagree, then that's a good thing that the IoT device can't join that network because it's doing something the network owner doesn't want that IoT device to do. And I know someone was mentioning when I was presenting that they had a lot of consternation about IoT devices doing bad things on their network anyway. So, you know, if the configuration of that IoT device isn't such that it matches what the network configuration is, then it shouldn't be on that network, right?
Yeah, good point. Now I know over the last few days, I think, Arno, you made some comments highlighting that there'd been some discussion. I think it was a year or so back in Semantic, and you'd gone down a sort of, I think, at least a parallel path in terms of a line of thinking. Is there anything from that you think is worth sharing that will be relevant to this discussion?
Hi guys, hi Andrew, and Happy New Year. I am fairly new to this group, even though I followed emails since some time. So I'm not sure if I am legitimate on that one. But the issue we have here is that we have a situation where two parties need to agree, and in fact we have I think it's Tommy who is making the point, is that we may or may not have a user, then we have the technical device, then we've got the network, and we need to find potentially an agreement or not. And I think if we do not have an agreement, that's fair too. The issue is, do we allow some veto rights from one party or the other in certain conditions? If I would be an enterprise, I would hate that some people are just going around my controls, because I need them to control for a lot of valid reasons, from legal reasons, from all sorts of security reasons, and so on. So the issue is that we have a difficulty to create some respectfulness into this whole in all the stakeholders that are here. Some parties want to rule some others down for obvious business reasons, and sometimes dogmatic reasons and other reasons, which I don't think is right, but that's what exists today. And to resolve that is not just a technical issue on how we organize the protocol. It has a lot to do for the human part with the UI and the UX, and the UI part, because there is a massive problem on educating people on that. It's not just a matter of, yes, we can resolve things technically. We could find something, but the big issue, the really, really big issue, is the human being into all of that. And here we are, what we observed when we created our proposal back on TLS issues, is that it was an area that was really untapped. So back to, I think it was Tommy who said that we have a larger problem than the one that he's trying to do here, or I think even Vinny said it, we have an ecosystem issue. Yes, we are missing some framework outside of what we are discussing today. And this framework does not exist. And it's even difficult to agree that we need such a framework, because it will clash on a security principle, where some people want to see a world where security is only put on the endpoints. And that's one group of people. And there is another group of people who say, no, you cannot. You need to have security on the endpoints and on the network. And this is a fundamental issue that is hiding behind what we are trying to do here. So we have quite a layered set of issues to resolve it. But fundamentally, I think I reacted on the fact that Tommy, I think, is right when he says that there is a larger issue behind. So now, if we could have a proper way to discuss, then I could call back what we have tried to do and try to come in with some things. But that's where I am right now.
Great, that's great, thank you. And helpful analysis as well, just to understand what the actual problem is, because if we're not clear collectively what the problem is, then I think you're right, it becomes difficult to agree on the solution. In terms of the sort of this ability for, I suppose, the network to specify what behaviors are acceptable, if I can use that phrase, if that doesn't sound too pejorative. I know that's got some echoes in some of the things that I think, Paul, you've raised previously as being quite important. I don't know if this discussion has then sort of generated any thoughts from your point of view as to what the right way forward or is, or whether these are the right issues.
Well, I appreciate the conversation, both on the mailing list and here. I think there is finally a broad understanding of sort of what is the economic and political agenda of that's behind various protocols. We are not getting closer to an answer to the question, who's going to bell the cat? But at least we seem to have identified a cat. So I appreciate that. I was just rereading the quick manageability internet draft. I'll put the URL here for those who want to see this. So when we get around to talking about DOQ, we're going to run into some issues there, which is that quick is by its own admission, not designed. It isn't, in this case, designed to frustrate interference, which DOH is. This one is simply not designed to facilitate interference, which comes to the same thing, but it's a little bit more politically acceptable. But we have the problem of conflicting agendas, and there are two conflicts. One, different people want to get done with different things, and they've got either an assignment from their employer or a project they've undertaken for their own personal reasons, which has to do with adding some bit of technology to the DNS stack, and they want to get that done, and they want to get out. And then what they don't want to do is get tangled up in the hairball of what does it all mean? Should we have negotiation, and so on. And I appreciate the desire as expressed. I didn't come here to boil the ocean. I've got, I have a teapot, and I just need to make that hot so I can get on with my life. Well, that's not going to be possible. It'll be possible if the working group and the IETF in general are willing to declare consensus on something that's quite controversial and on which there is not consensus. It can still be declared. But anyway, that is a frustration that some people have said, which is, why didn't you solve this earlier? Why is this now an extra domino that has been placed in front of my domino that I now have to get involved in your DNS hairball stuff before I can add the simple thing that I need to add for my own reasons? I'm sort of getting, I get that. I don't want people who feel that way to understand I am hearing you. I don't like it any better than you do. The other conflict is some people really believe RFC 8890, that the internet is for end users. The trouble is I don't have a Wi-Fi chip in my brain. I access the internet through technology. So the protocol is going to allow that technology to work in certain ways and offer certain features. And if that is by default near perfect entropy so that the traffic is unmanageable because whatever NSA, Snowden, or the Chinese firewall, whatever it is, if that's the way some people are treating this, then they don't want to hear about, couldn't you add negotiation for that? And so those of us with corporate networks or family networks, or those of us, which I think is everyone on this call, who fears IoT, because no IoT device will ever be profitable from its own manufacture or distribution. All the profit comes from later activities, and not all of those activities would pass the consent test if there was such a test. And most users would say, gee, if that's what I got to do to have a smart TV, take it out of here. But we're not asking for consent. We're certainly not asking for informed consent. So that's the political difference. And if having perfect entropy so that those of us who need to manage our networks are forced to use a really big hammer to do it, I guess that I appreciate the passion behind that political philosophy. I don't share it, but that is a whole other hairball that I don't want to get involved in. I just want to identify that's uppermost in our discussions, is that some people are wondering why we care about this. The IAB said encrypt everything, make it unmanageable. And now you guys are saying that the network should have a vote. Well, no, end users should have all the votes. Well, okay, the end users using some device, and that manufacturer gets a say now, that the manufacturer who would once have had to get the network operator to consent to something no longer requires that consent. And that's a bit of a problem. And it's bigger than just DNS. But I don't think we should try to solve the DNS problem without having some kind of signaling that allows me as a network operator to know that this device is not doing what it was told it was permitted to do. This device is trying to do something that is outside the policy it was told, because that gives me what I need to say, hey, what's the MAC address? Hey, what switchboard is it on? Hey, whose office is that in? And you can just go search and seize and say you've got a non-compliant device, and I want that out of here. If we don't have that, then a lot of the things that network operators need to do are going to be rendered impossible. And so, I'm sorry, I really do regret asking for you people with teapots to please help us boil this ocean. But I think we have to, because otherwise this whole thing gets down to armed camps, and that's not the internet way. Sorry to go on at length.
That's okay, thanks. That was helpful, Paul, I think. And Tommy, you got your hand raised. I was going to ask you, because Paul touched on the point about this maybe comes before DNS. I think you raised some questions in the mailing list in terms of whether this sat within this working group, or perhaps you thought it sat somewhere else. What's your current thinking on that, as well as if you had any questions or other comments?
Certainly. So I do think it's bigger than the ADD working group, assuming that's the working group we're talking about, because like I said, I do agree that that's a story worth having. And I agreed with that last year when it came up before as well. The problem is to gate that and say that we don't want to work on bootstrapping until we've solved that problem is an artificially large gap. And I wouldn't want to describe what we're attempting to do in the working group as a teapot. This isn't a hit and run. People like me are in this for the long haul. And the reason that we're taking the approach that we are right now is so that it will continue to work in decades to come, as opposed to just the next year or two. Because we don't want to be, as the client, in the business of doing what we're currently doing, which is maintaining a list of our own. We want to be able to negotiate our connections. I don't think that characterizing an attempt to do that negotiation that does not also solve the, as of yet, unaddressed problem of network client communication on policy, I don't think gating on that is helpful, because whatever work we do today to help bootstrap the connection will not paint us into a corner with anything that the network does to communicate policy in the future. Because this is just one of many, many, many network flows that also introduce encryption. And so I just want to push back on the teapot comment, Paul. I'm not here to hit and run, because I'm assuming I'm part of that camp you're addressing.
Well, I appreciate that you're not here for hit and run. And you are part of the camp I was addressing. And so in that sense, I misspoke, and I apologize for the inclarity. DNS turned out to be a great place to enforce network policy. And at the time that this whole internet experiment was convened, it really was a network of networks, not a network of CDNs and IoTs. Not a network of human eyeballs. It was a network of networks. And so being able to treat DNS as part of our control plane has allowed us to get out in front of connection startups where we have reason to suspect that the connection being started up is maybe coming from malware, intruders, poison supply chain, and the rest. And certainly with Quick, we're seeing a move toward near perfect entropy, and yet I would not want us to say that because there's so many other ways in which the network, this is no longer a network of networks, other than maybe in the routing sense, that there are so many other ways that the operators of those networks have been sort of disintermediated, that we should not try and solve the narrow problem within the confines of DNS. And this recapitulates some of the traffic that was on the mailing list from the last meeting. I don't want to call it a teapot. What I do want to say is we had a status quo. The DNS had a status quo, which was you could manage your network by managing your DNS. And of course, that management has been systematically abused by ISPs, by nation-state actors, by people who are entities who are really not on the user's side, and they're also not on the network operator's side, not on the endpoint side. And so I appreciate the desire to just kind of solve this and move on. But DOH created a very interesting problem set by saying that this protocol is designed to prevent on-path interference in DNS operations. That's on page 1 of that RFC. It kind of it says it's no longer a network of networks. It doesn't matter what the on-path actor, who is the endpoint operator or the edge network operator, it doesn't matter what they want, because their interests are indistinguishable from nation state, surveillance capitalism, and other things that we really don't want to support. Okay, that was a political action, and I don't think that it was the right one. I think that the working group who was working on that did not understand how DNS was used to enforce policy by edge networks. But now they do. Now we all know. Now we see this. And I would like to, in fact, undo that damage. I would like to find something in our negotiation protocol that, and I don't care if it's negotiation per se. I have thoughts about negotiation, but I don't care. That's what I simply want is to know that a policy was offered that is at variance with what that client then does, what that end system then does, so that we can find out of policy devices and manage the network that contains those. I guarantee that if I am upset that somebody's DDoSing me and they say, well, nothing I can do about that, it's all quick, it's all DOH, it's all stuff, it's perfect entropy, I have no ability to take responsibility for the traffic emanating from my network, that won't be the end of that conversation. It's just going to get thorny from there. So I think what I'm hoping is that we treat this as part of the same problem, and that we don't solve the how do we get DOH bootstrapped without also solving the how do we identify non or out of policy endpoints. And again, I appreciate that not everybody wants to solve both problems, but I think we have to solve the problem created by DOH. Other than by having network operators have to somehow enumerate, identify, and block traffic to those, because we all know that won't scale. That makes it bad engineering. So we have to deal with this politics.
Thanks.
That's all.
Thanks, Paul. Quite philosophical there. Whilst you were talking, I can see some comments in the chat. So Barbara highlighting about some of the endpoint sort of challenges with smart TVs and so on, I think echoing some of the points made in the discussion. Vittorio and Chris have commented on the definition of end users in RFC 8890. And in case you haven't read it, I've put a link to RFC 8890 if anyone's interested. I don't think, just picking up on Vittorio's comment, that it did suggest within that RFC that it was the big internet platforms would qualify as end users, or at least that wasn't my read of it. I read it more, it was the device user, or it also referred to indirect users, which could be an organization, an enterprise, could be a government in some cases. And others, and I think Chris has put some by the look of it, I think an extract from the RFC in the chat, just to clarify on that. So it's not necessarily literally the end user, and certainly not the end point, was my read on the RFC. Anyway, Glenn and Arno have both raised their virtual hands. So Glenn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi. I'll not do the video so that people don't have to look at my crazy COVID hair. Almost 1 year in counting with no haircut. So let me touch on a couple of points that have been raised here. Number one, I do agree, and this is where my AVE chair hat, that a lot of this topic that we're discussing today is really way out of the scope of AVE. It's an important topic, but it's really beyond the scope of what that group has been tasked to work on. But I see how that group fits in my mind at least, is that its role is to ultimately produce a standardized mechanism by which the network infrastructure, and that consists of both the network and services on the network like DNS operators, can provide back to a client attempting to join that environment the information that that client needs to be able to identify and select a DOS server. And so the conversation of, well, what is the policy, and who sets the policy and who controls the policy, and that whole scope, I don't think we need to solve that, because that's going to be a very broad, ongoing, developing thing for years to come. Because even after we're all done with ADD and other things, I think there will be continued innovation around policies based upon either political goals, organizational goals, or business goals of operators or content providers. And so the more basic task right now is to sort of understand, well, what is the kind of things that people might want to convey? Not the details of it, but sort of the broad picture of the sorts of things people want to convey, and how do you build a mechanism to convey that without trying to neatly say it's only this and now we're done in terms of what you can convey. And so when I've looked at some of the proposals that have floated through the AD discussion in the past year, one of the things that I've noticed is we've shifted from some of the similar or the simple approaches, which were simply like, hey, we're going to put like for instance, some of the stuff that you use today in some of the pre-standard environments, where it simply says, yeah, here it is. Look for this name, you'll get the answer, and you're done. Okay, there's no real range of possibilities or additional providers provided. There's just, here's the answer. And clearly we need solutions that are bigger thinking than that, and that they convey the information in a more abstract way than just here's a simple answer. But to Paul's point, I think that one of the conflicts we definitely do face here is that historically the internet's architecture has been, how do I make a network of networks that works together and allows devices at the edge to connect to it and send data across that network of networks. And so DNS is a network of networks fundamental service that translates names and numbers. We stuck a whole bunch of other stuff into it, policy, we stuck mail addresses, we stuck AFSDB records, we stuck URLs, but fundamentally the core of it is that network of networks. And I think the conflict we're seeing arises from, we have this other class of things, which are this sort of sea of endpoints who, according to some philosophies that are in some of the RFC documents, would really like not to be on a network of networks. They would like to be in a sea of nodes or a sea of endpoints that have, open, seamless, conversations between the endpoints with no network interference, no network involvement, and no network engagement. And so the network there is reduced to sort of this magic black box that stuff goes in and magically appears on the other side without anything else going on. And that's the fundamental conflict, because we do have, networks aren't quite that simple. Networks don't just transmit data instantaneously from one device to another device. They pass through a whole lot of pieces in between the source and the destination. And those sources and destinations need to coordinate on the network level to get those packets there. And they need to coordinate on the network level for resolution for IP addresses and stuff like that, because those are network resources and network identifiers. And so we do have a fundamental conflict, I think, that is showing up here in spades. What is the future? And it's, you know, a prediction of mine that, you know, if we were to go to the end state that some people would like us to get to, where the network is just this black box, and over the network we transit things like QUIC with, you know, a multiplex pipe with a lot of stuff carrying over it. It's different channels and they're all non-blocking. We haven't solved the problem that they're actually trying to solve. We've just shifted. We've moved it up into whoever your QUIC operator is, who operates your endpoint demuxer, because the endpoint demuxer is going to see everything you're doing, and your endpoint demuxer is going to have the opportunity to enforce policies, whether they're surveillance policies or filtering policies. And so it's not, you know, if we get to that perfect world, we just replace one network with a network of QUIC pipes. And so it's important to solve it. And I mean, I'm taking a long stretch here, but this is why this is important to solve, this fundamental building block in ADD, because it allows for the old network of networks to participate in the discovery mechanism that is going to connect with the endpoint devices of the users, and then give them the bootstrap into that other world, the sea of nodes. So there's my philosophy, but and some specifics, Andrew.
Not bad for your first call of the new year, I think, Glenn. Thank you. Right, I see I've got Arno, then Jim, and then there's a couple of interesting points on the chat, which we'll come back to. And then I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well to make sure we wrap up within the hour. So Arno.
Yeah, so thank you. It's really interesting discussion. And of course, I have a lot of sympathy for what Paul Vixie has organized as the perhaps philosophical, but I think it's really important to recognize that. Now, from let's say from a more design perspective, granted, we cannot absorb the world's frustrations into this conversation. That's beyond us. But what we could consider is what types of mechanisms we want to offer in terms of two parties to negotiate something. So in a way, it reminds me something that happened more than 20 years ago when email started. And at that moment, we had clients that had to discover what they could do with the email server. And people started to think, but wait a minute, we have the problem for email, for contacts, for calendaring, for this, for that. And in fact, they realized that the client did not have a configuration protocol. So people tried to do the application configuration access protocol, ACAP. And of course, it was shut down by a certain big party at that time because this was, let's say, going to contradict their business, their business reasons. So a certain party that I will not name basically killed it. But in this aspect, when the ACAP protocol started, we had already the problem of, I am a client with these abstractions of what I can do with you server. And then the server had the same abstraction. So at least people had the same approach to represent the world. So they could represent whatever they wanted. It was done by models, data model that could be published. And then people could use the data to actually negotiate something. So that's one thing. But now, that does not resolve the problem of the negotiation itself. So the problem of the negotiation itself, what we could consider if we really want to think out of the box, we could consider back to mathematics. That's a collective choice. I have a certain number of parties, and you don't need to have just two parties. You can have multiple parties. Each of them have their preference. What is the mathematical collective choice algorithm you use to actually resolve that? You can allow veto rights, you can allow all sorts of things, and you can actually characterize the collective choice you want versus certain axiomatics there in terms of you should be fair with the variance, with the candidates, with a number of mathematics there. So it's a very, very deep mathematics that could actually be used to actually resolve something. And there we could allow anything. We could allow networks of networks to any type of models would be allowed, because you would have one way that each object can fractalize itself in the whole architecture and have its own autonomous way to negotiate something. Maybe it's a bit abstract, but if someone likes it, I could develop more at some point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Arno. And yes, it is quite a big set of questions, I think, before we even get on to the answers. Okay, final comment or question, I think, to Jim, and then I'll try and just pull out a couple of the points from the chat. So, Jim, do you want to jump on?
Thanks, Andrew. Good Happy New Year to everybody. I'm still on holiday today because Scotland gets an extra day at New Year for reasons I don't need to go into. This has been a very interesting discussion, and we've touched on a bunch of different things here, which are going to be quite tricky to try and deal with. And what I'm trying to get my head around from this point of view is, where does this discussion take place? Some of it seems appropriate for IETF. On the other hand, we're talking about policy issues, which are clearly something which is not going to fly in an IETF setting. So there may be a question, I think, for Glenn, in a discussion with the IESG about what might be a suitable forum for this. Maybe it goes into the IRTF as a research group, possibly, I don't know. But there may be a need for another working group, but given the gestation that they've had for the ad working group, that doesn't seem to be a wise path to go down. And I think it would also be very unpleasant if we tried to go down that path anyway. But I do think we need something to have a forum to discuss this, but it will still have to come back ultimately to the IETF and for some form of documentation, how best to do that. Maybe this is a thing that Eddie could do if it was a bit more than just a mailing list, but I don't know. And I think that's a problem that we're going to have to tackle as part of this discussion. There's all sorts of interesting concerns here. Some of them are technical, some of them are policy, but the two still are somewhat entangled, and it's not clear if they can actually be untangled and separated out. And that then gives us a very, very difficult thing to do in terms of standardizing, trying to figure out interoperability considerations and all the rest of it. And with that, I'm going to shut up.
That's a good summary though, Jim. It's complicated and it needs a home, certainly. Or somewhere where it can be discussed. Okay, well, just to then highlight in the chat, and I will put these into the call notes. I think there's quite a few comments around whether DNS is the right place for a control plane, particularly for this sort of stuff. And I'm horribly summarizing much longer comments than that, so please read the comments properly to get the gist of that. I think it's fair to say from the comments that there are differing views as to the usefulness or otherwise of DNS, and also whether actually CDNs and content providers will ultimately be the gatekeepers in the future. And of course, those of you that are keeping up with certainly European Commission stuff of late will know that becoming a gatekeeper brings with it some interesting connotations. So maybe that's a discussion for another day. And I see Glenn just jumping right down to the bottom is, I think, unconvinced about the ITF and policy, but certainly there needs a discussion somewhere as to where that is maybe sort of a point we need to come back to later in the new year. So thank you. I think that was an interesting discussion, which I will try and summarize in the notes. And I will urge you to perhaps also play back the recording as well to get the full nuances, because it's quite difficult to bring out those fully in the call notes, but I'll get those out to you shortly. In the meantime, just very quickly, a couple of things to highlight. Those of you that wanted to put papers forward for OARC 34 or the NDSS workshop, the closing date for both of those is today. So please make sure if you did have an intent to do that, you need to put something in quite quickly.
Andrew, can I just interrupt you a second, because I'm on the program committee for DNS OARC, and the deadline's been extended to next Monday.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I missed that this morning. So helpful update, Brett. I'll update that on the notes as well then. So you've got a few more days for OARC at least, but the deadlines are looming. Also, the early bird registration rate for ITF 110 is coming up in a couple of weeks or so, so it's relatively near. And also we got the next UK North event later this month. I didn't have a chance to check if there's an early bird registration deadline for that, but if there is, I suspect it's coming up very soon. Again, all the links to all of those are in the sort of weekly news headlines, and I'll include them at the bottom of the notes as well. Finally, from me, just a reminder, we got as I mentioned at the start, the DOQ discussion with the CTO of AdGuard next week, and at some point we need to revisit the use case sort of discussion as well, I think, which may or may not be next week. Is there anything else that anyone wants to bring up briefly in the last 60 seconds or so? Give you a chance to jump in if you wish. If not, then hopefully that's given you all some food for thought on, I suspect for most people, our collective first day back. So welcome back, everyone. Happy New Year one last time. Have a fantastic week, and look forward to seeing hopefully all of you next Monday for an interesting discussion with AdGuard on their DOQ resolver. So speak again soon. Thanks all.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.